morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. Congratulations for a wonderful event. I would like to make some comments complementary to those that we have just listened to. First of all, when we talk about enlargement, I think it's important to realize that from the EU's point of view, this is both a quite key and natural objective and a formidable measure of success. Natural objective, think of it. I mean, the EU process, the EU process has always been a process with key political purpose. I mean, in the purpose in the founding fathers' intentions, the process had a clear aim, was to make war impossible on EU. The EU, the EC, is the result of this main motivation of the founding fathers. So it's as political as it can be. And they decided to go in this political direction through the economic integration. So if the aim is to create the space of peace, stability, prosperity, naturally, when you are in that space, you have every interest to expand it. And when you are not in that space, you want to be part of it. So it's a natural process, a very strong process that has changed our continent. It's also a measure of success from the basic common sense argument that many want to join. Almost everybody wants to join, almost everybody. None wants to leave, despite all. That means something. When we talk about the economic part of it, I think the facts are here, and they are very strong. You heard the key elements concerning the 10, now 12, more recent member states. I would add the four previous ones, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain, because we have seen the same mechanism, the same process. We have seen a process through which the less prosperous member states have constantly done better than the remaining. I think that's a formidable success, something to be very proud about in a world where inequalities are increasing. It's not a normal process to have inequalities decreasing. It's the contrary. If you look at the world and with the exception of the really strongly emerging countries like China, India, Brazil, etc., overall the inequalities are increasing. Well, the EU has succeeded formidably. If you look at the four that I mentioned, Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland, you see where they are now, where they were when they joined, not only in absolute terms, but in relative terms, and you were given really a very convincing presentation of how much the same process is functioning for the last 10 or 12 member states. Interesting to note that this convergence is not only between the new and the core of the old member states. The new member states of the EU, the last 10 years, have done constantly better even than the US in terms of average economic growth. Now, this raises a number of fundamental questions. How is it that why is it that the new perform better than the older member states? What is the EU's relations with economic growth? Is the EU a formidable engine of growth? Whoever gets in grows spectacularly? Or is it a bureaucratic impediment to growth? And you know that in average the EU the last 10, 12 years has done less well in terms of growth than the US. So that's the kind of arguments that we have around us constantly. Let me give you a few key considerations, try very briefly in a few moments, give you some elements that I think are very important for somebody who tries to understand and give answers to these important considerations. First of all, I think it's important to understand what the accession process is from the economic and social point of view. And not only that, globally, what it means globally for the candidate member state, for the new member state, I think you have to think briefly to start with the Copenhagen criteria, the conditions that need to be met in order for a new member state to be part of the club. These criteria cover almost everything. Democracy, rule of law, human rights, minorities, but also the market economy, the ability to cope with competition, and the acquis. The acquis was mentioned briefly. The acquis is the obligation of the new member state to adopt the whole set of rules, regulations, laws that the EU has created through the duration of its life. Now, this acquis is it's an enormous piece and an enormous challenge. It affects almost every aspect of the economic, social, and otherwise life of the new member state. It concerns environment, food safety, a lot of social standards, labor law, safety at work, etc., a lot of regulations. It's a big process. My point is, I think it's important to see this process of accession for what it is. And it's a profound challenge of reform. Reforms that go in one direction, which is modernizing in an accelerating pace the country that is committed in that process. And that's why, and I would agree with the previous speaker, it's not the funds that explain the spectacular growth of the new member states. The funds are important. The support that the country receives from the EU mechanisms, financial mechanism, is significant. For many of these new member states, historically, it has been a few percentage of their GDP. But fundamentally, the key factor is this modernizing push. Once you realize that, I think the next step is to realize that this is something extremely challenging, extremely difficult. We all know what kind of reforms are needed in almost every economy around the world, in our own countries, constantly. The challenge is how to make them possible. And this process of accession, it's something which is extremely demanding, because the reforms are very high, they are happening very quickly, and they are happening under a process of very strict conditionality. I mean, there is no negotiating margin for the member state that is getting the future member state in the process, and the member state that enters in the EU. The rules have to be accepted. The acquis has to be adopted. I really, if I look at the international community and processes, I have difficulties to imagine, to identify any other process of so strict conditionality. So how is this possible? And that's the other aspect I think we need to understand if we want to interpret what we are seeing. And there enters something to which I believe very much. You cannot understand the EU only on the basis of statistics and on the basis of institutions. You have to realize what is the relation between the EU and its citizens, or its future citizens. In fact, there are two elements that make this process, this extraordinary process possible. First is that the accession has always created in the country that commits in the process of accession a unique consensus. It becomes a kind of national objective beyond political parties. The public opinion accepts that it's in the national interest to commit in that process, to get there. And this makes all this reform process politically possible. Because all this conditionality is not imposed at all. It's democratically accepted. And that's my second point. There is this formidable mechanism, again unique to the EU, where democratically accepted objectives become obligations that impose themselves. But it's not imposed by an outside will. It's imposed through the acceptance and the support that the public opinion of the country gives. And is this mechanism, this relationship with the vision and the aspiration, that's the wrong button, it's just It's not intended. It's this extraordinary process and this link with the future citizens of the EU that explain this formidable process that has changed the European continent. That's the famous EU soft power, very often called soft power of the EU. But that's how this process has changed our continent. Now, there is one additional dimension that I think we need to keep in mind when we talk about when we think about what impact the EU is having on growth. And this is the impact that the whole system has on the life of the individual, of the EU citizen. What does it mean when you become an EU citizen? Well, a lot of things, but basically a set of additional rights. You can go and study to the neighbor's country, you can settle, you can open a business, you can work. It's a set of additional freedom. It's a space the EU creates for the individual citizens, a space of additional freedom, including economic additional freedom, within an economic space that is much more integrated. And if you see the process like this, I think it gives the basic elements of explanation why this process of accession to the EU is a formidable growth, is a formidable push towards additional growth. Now, does this mean that when you enter the EU, that's it? You are in the paradise of growth and you will continue to grow forever? And where is the end of this process? There is an obvious end of this process. And that explains the difference between the old and the new member states from that point of view. The EU is not doing everything. We are not EU replacing the member states in any respect. We remain a union of sovereign member states. A lot of the economic policy responsibility remain with the member states. Think of the original countries of the EU. Let's take mainly France, Germany, Italy. That's the three economies that explain the difference that in growth performance that we had with the US the last 10, 12 years. We know that the big part of the difference of the growth potential is because of labor market reforms needed and other structural reform needed. Well, these reforms are of the direct competence of the member states. It's not EU policy. The EU does not bring answers to everything. The EU creates a formidable framework within which an important stimulation is given to the new entrants, and from there on, you are in an environment of an increased competition with a huge margin of responsibility left to the national governments. And what the EU does is what we try to do with our Lisbon strategy, is create mechanisms that push or help the member states to go towards the right direction, complement what we do at the level of the EU in terms of right policies, opening to the world, performing better among ourselves, and make sure that the national economic policies go in the right direction. And I think that hopefully we can claim some success there too. For the last months of the last year, for the first time, the EU grew more quickly than the US. Just a word, we had an agreement not to be too long to take enough questions from the audience, but just a word about the future. I think it's very important. I will not enter into all this discussion, possible difficult issues that the EU has to deal with. As I said, it's not the ultimum paradise. There are plenty of challenges. But I think they are the essentials and the less essentials. Let me tell you what I believe is extremely important when we think about the future and the relevance of the EU. Let's take for a second the main challenges of the European economies that we all share. I took 4 points. You can classify differently, but they are certainly among the main challenges that we face. We need to jointly, individually, project our economic interests in the world, right? When we have the environment, the energy, access to resources, we have fundamental interest. We are a very important player in the world. We need to project our economic interest. We need to help to shape the future of the world. You can think of the need to establish global standards, but also the need to project our economic values, the market economy, the free trade, etc., or the need to manage the increase on the world economic scene of countries like China or India. We need to improve our internal economic space. We have created a common market, but it's not perfect. We have a lot to do, and I think you've heard some examples about these challenges. We need to improve this economic liberty for our citizens, for each one individually, their ability to take initiatives and to move around freely and to act and increase the entrepreneurship for all. In all these challenges, and you can go on, really, if you think of it, it's obvious that we have a fundamental interest to act together. And that's a formidable engine for EU's own integration, for EU's relevance, for EU's advancement. We need to act together. We have an interest to act together. In many of these issues, we can only get it right together. If you think of it, the need to act more and more together, you need to realize how much of a formidable mechanism was created by the EU. I said before, it's not a new state. It's not a complete integration. It's this concept of the Europeans getting together, sharing part of their sovereignty when they have an interest to better serve the citizens of the EU. That's why the EU sometimes is difficult to understand, because it's not the new state. It's not what we know from a state, but it's a formidable mechanism of ad hoc transfer of sovereignty in order to create the mechanisms that better serve the EU citizens. I will add, because I know that there is an issue of great sensitivity within our new member states, this concept of sovereignty, of losing sovereignty. We cannot really discuss this in depth, but I think if you really look at it, if you look at the areas where we pull our sovereignty to be able to act together, we are not losing any of it. In fact, in many respects, it's pulling it together in order to preserve it and in order to fulfill what is the aim of national sovereignty, which is to serve the interests of our citizens. And that's what the EU is about. It's about serving the interests of our citizens, and if we want to understand the EU, I repeat, we cannot understand it if we do not add to the technicalities of it the importance of vision, the importance of inspiration, the importance of the link that there is between the EU and the public opinion, despite the shortcomings and the challenges. I think I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.